To begin the second panel of today's proceedings, the theme that we're going to be delivering is overcoming fear. And fear is not just something political. Obviously, it's been understood for a long time that there's really two ways of managing society. One is to inspiring that society to become better. People like Martin Luther King, Benjamin Franklin, all of the greatest leaders of history took on that approach, that is through love of your fellow man and inspiring a passion for the future, that you're going to get the most coherence out of your population to perform the best. JFK's space program is a recent example of that, and what we're seeing coming out of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, LaRouche, and the whole new alliance that's now being set up is really an expression of that sentiment. But what's another way to control society? What's another sentiment that can be used to manage a society, if not love?
Fear and anger.
Fear and anger. So fear is obviously something which has been observed for a long time, going back to Pharaoh and beyond, that is effective at keeping people in line like cattle. To the degree that people are afraid, they're not going to be thinking in a solution-oriented manner, especially in a time of crisis. And that's certainly no different for today. People often think that science is out of the purview of political agendas. Science is pure, right? We get this a lot when we're organizing astronauts, people look up the scientific community who say, oh, I like truth, but I don't like politics. I want to just do my science. And little do they realize that that's the most political place in the world. Because there's a battle over science. Who controls the interpretations of scientific facts? Right? Because the science, whatever science you have will be able to be perverted to justify the expansion of an evil structure of empire. That's been like that for a long time too. Today, two of the core fears that people have in the Western society, which I'm going to address one of them, is the fear of radiation. And I'm using this topic, that it's actually the fear itself which is deadly. The radiation itself is not. After I present, Dr. Bob Hutz will come in and he's going to present something on climate change, why mankind should not be afraid that we are causing global warming because we're industrialized, because we're growing our population. These are not real legitimate fears. They've been implanted there in our hearts artificially as a political agenda. Megan Beats and Pim both went through the issue of Prometheus versus Zeus, that the best way to understand human history is to recognize that there is a principal difference between the worldview and passion of a Prometheus, expressed in such people as we saw, John F. Kennedy and those who I mentioned, versus a Zeusian character like Obama, like the Queen, like the whole empire structure controlling and managing the transatlantic community. One other way to put this, to think about this in another clear way, is one represents a closed system, a system that assumes that whatever resources exist at a given time are finite, that the system as a whole that you want to manage is a closed, finite system, and the role of the governing class is really to keep things in line, to get people to fight over diminishing returns of resources. Because obviously, the more you grow, like Megan said, the Earth is finite. The more a population grows, the more resources it uses, the more tension builds up, and the more conflicts can be triggered artificially, over water, over oil, over whatever. An opposing view is that, no, actually, maybe resources are something that are, like Megan also made a point. She said resources are actually created. That things that we today call a resource 1,000 years ago were not resources. Iron before the Iron Age was not a resource. You had to have human thoughts and discoveries that were able to discover that there was something within the substance of matter that, given certain conditions that we could create, would allow us to harness that and call it a resource. Otherwise, it was just a rock. Right? Oil 300 years ago was not a resource. It was something that maybe you could discover could light a lamp. So the question of what is really the resource, what's the constant, out of all of the change of human history, of our changing relationship to the universe, of resources, there's all sorts of change, but what are the constants? What don't change? What allows for the transitions from lower states of potential to higher states of potential, to higher expressions of creativity? And that's going to largely be the substance of my class. In as short a period as I can. I have to end in about an hour and 5 minutes, so I'm going to see what I can get through, maybe not the whole thing. But first up, today we have seen, this is something that the organization produced a little while ago, to get a sense that in the last since 1780, there's been a general trend regarding the types of fire that we use, whether the fire is derived from burning wood, or burning coal, or burning oil, or burning chemical fuels, or burning things like the atom. There's been a general trend where what we've seen is that there's a per capita accessibility of energy for society which has been increasing at a relatively exponential rate, leading all the way up through the 1960s and into the beginning of the 70s. Now, the general trend has been that, I mean, at a certain point, all there was wood, right? When coal became observed to be so much more efficient, that the amount of volume that you can burn from coal will produce so much more work, to do so much more good for humanity, the wood was increasingly phased out of our energy basket in the West. Obviously, due to empire, the developing sector of the world still burns a lot of wood in places like Africa and South America and beyond. But what we had is a phasing out of the less efficient form of fire and a replacement with the more efficient one, which each one is finite. But you had a similar downward trend as oil became observed to be more efficient than coal. Coal became less used as oil became more of its replacement, until we started discovering something around the course of the Manhattan Project in the United States, that there's something within the atom itself that can be unlocked, which is such a great source of power, that it would make all of the other forms of fossil fuels completely redundant. And that began to take hold, and then what we had is a plateau for the past 40 years, since society became a globalized consumer society in the West. When we stopped developing, we let go of the future orientation that was put into motion by John F. Kennedy, we stopped that transitionary process of going towards more efficient fuels, and we became locked into a petrodollar. The decision was made to shut down all nuclear reactors. We stopped building nuclear power plants in Canada in the 1980s. In the US, really hasn't had there haven't been any new ones put online for the past 30 years. Europe, as we see it, is completely denuclearizing. Germany, Spain, they're all calling for denuclearizing. While what we see is that there are three different trends here. One was our science team analysis of where we should have been had we continued the trajectory of John F. Kennedy, approximately mostly nuclear at this point. A 1983 EIR analysis, which put us approximately where we should be. And then a JFK administration forecast in 1962. All of them are far beyond what we are. Because they were all premised on the idea that we would continue existing as a productive economy, right? Or that we would go back to becoming a productive economy, because if you're just consuming and you're not producing, obviously that system is going to be closed and will drain and collapse. You're sitting yourself on a collapsed function, which is why Tim, in his opening remarks, made the point that LaRouche was able to forecast as far back into the 70s that the IMF World Bank system was doomed to self-implode unless systemic changes were not reintroduced based on future development. Today, where's the nuclear reactors? In terms of all of the construction sites where nuclear reactors are being built, there's something very stark that strikes out, which is that none of them are happening in the transatlantic. Yes, you do have some being built. There's a couple being built slowly in the United States, too. You got a couple in Europe. But in green, what you have in general, it says here countries that have either banned nuclear power plant construction or are doing very little to further their previously existing programs. Everywhere that you have over 78% of the nuclear reactors being built today are in Russia, India, China, and Korea. Right? About 85% include Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, South Africa, a couple of others. Nothing is really good. Why is that? People in the West who are a little bit self-conceited sometimes look at this and say, oh, well, the developing sector, they must just be stupid. There's something, they don't realize how dangerous radiation is. There's something wrong with them. The reality is that these countries actually want to develop. They're not of the conception, as we have been trained to become, that we can stop developing. If you want to develop, if you want to elevate people out of poverty, you need qualities of energy that are far beyond anything that can be provided for by windmills and solar panels. You can't melt industrial steel across the world if you want to have a completely decarbonized energy basket with windmills and solar panels as your primary fuel source. It just can't happen. So these countries know that. They're not stupid, and that's why they actually are functioning at industrializing and progressing. But this fear of radiation, which has been at the heart of getting society to consent to the shutdown of our nuclear orientation that we once had, this came out of a fear. People say it was democratic. People don't want this. Canadians don't want nuclear power. Well, is that they don't want this, or was that emotion put there through a lot of shock therapy and subterfuge in the media over years? Well, First of all, most people don't even know what radiation is. Obviously, people have seen this image before, right? This is something new that we've recently understood as being what is known in things that, different types of light. Now, obviously, you know, the part of the light spectrum here, which is visible, is very small, maybe 1 octave of frequency, of things that we could see. All the light that you encounter that hits your eye and bounces off things that you can sense with your eyeball is a very small amount. Now, over time, it has been discovered that there are portions of invisible energy emitted all the time, all over the place. And when something is invisible and you're told it'll kill you, you can easily become afraid of it. And that's largely why the fear exists, because people can't see it, right? It's just something that's, you know, it's just there. Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3-headed fish from The Simpsons. Like, there's this type of imagery is put in our minds that we don't realize that this is something we can understand and that we can actually empower ourselves to respect the laws of nature more by understanding where these discoveries come from. Who were the Prometheans who gave birth to the discoveries that we now can see represented in this chart from radio frequencies to gamma rays? Because this is the greatest gift for mankind. In what way, and this is a big question, in what way, where do they come from? Do they come from external sources, internal sources? What causes these radiations to emit? Has anybody seen this image before, these 4 objects? Yeah? Do you know what they are? What are we looking at?
The different rays, right?
They're different rays? But of what are they looking at 4 different things?
Are they looking at a single galaxy?
It's a nebula.
Crab Nebula.
Yeah, Crab Nebula. You're looking at one thing. Yeah, this is the Crab Nebula. Now, the Crab Nebula is something which appeared maybe 1,000 years ago that Chinese astronomers observed just being, you know, in its creation. And in recent years, we've discovered that when you put different filters on your telescopes, this is what your telescope sees. But in the radio frequencies, it's giving off a very different image. In infrared, it's giving off another image. In X-rays, it's got something very interesting, right? Where all of a sudden you're seeing a very organized spiral process with something very, very dense in the middle, projecting some form of X-ray plasma from both directions. But you wouldn't get that if you were just looking at what your eyes could pick up. So obviously, this is something which is emitting mass amounts of gamma rays, X-rays, radio waves, all the time, flooding into all parts of our solar system. And if you, just look at what exactly is the Earth and what is our solar system, it's a densely saturated zone of radiation of all frequencies of the spectrums at different intervals, constantly moving through the galaxy, the solar system, and the other galaxies that are also having an effect on our galaxy. And things happen, you know, the effects on the Earth change according to the electromagnetic field of the sun, which changes and pulsates over different cycles of 11 years, some cycles of upwards of 100 years or more, some upwards of tens of thousands of years, like the precession of the equinox. So you have cycles within cycles of electromagnetic processes mediating the flow of radiations. But then again, the question is, well, is it really just from the outside that we're being bombarded? Because we are a part of life, right? Life has been evolving on the Earth for millions of years, billions of years. Is there anywhere else that we find it maybe from within? And people who are trained to be afraid of radiation often don't take into consideration, this is a small graph of some of the major radioactive elements in life, in the human body. Every single second of the day, if people, I don't know, who likes bananas here? Okay, who doesn't like bananas? What kind of fruit doesn't like bananas? I apologize for any fruits that don't like bananas. That's the most radioactive fruit you could possibly imagine. Inside of bananas, you have an isotope called potassium-40. Potassium-40 gives off 4,400 disintegrations per second.
Wow.
Inside your body, carbon-14, one of the rarest forms of carbon, there's 3 of them. So one of the rarest forms of carbon is also very radioactive. It gives off beta and alpha decays, and there's 3,000 occurring in your body at every second. Then you have rubidium, and others that are not even on this list that are constantly occurring over the course of a day, there's billions of radioactive decays inside of the human body. And what's been discovered is that for animals that were fed, like in the 50s, there were all of these studies done when this was observed, that there was something called hormosis, that for animals that had the radioactive isotope taken out of the food that they were eating, like mice that would have different potassium isotopes removed artificially from the food, so that the food would have the same molecular structure, they would eat it, but their cells would look like cells, their cells wouldn't change, but they would stop working. The animals would actually get sick until the radiation, the normal radiation, was permitted to go back into their food, and then their cells would start working again.
But wait, it's all food that has it, or like what was the big
All
word?
food has it in different degrees. Some food, like fruits especially, have a lot of it. Frankly, even meats have it. And another thing too is people who go to hot springs, right? I was watching a documentary, and I was going through all of these hippies that were fighting their whole lives to shut down nuclear energy. And one of them had a bit of a wake-up call when they were starting to research, well, what is this nuclear energy that I'm trying to fight so hard to shut down? And they went to see their friends who were hanging out in this Arizona hot spring, and they're like, wait a minute, there's more radiation here than there is in a nuclear reactor in this hot spring, because it's all full of radium. And they're like, yeah, man, but it's natural. So you have natural background radiation. You got food, radiation in our food, radiation from the cosmos, constantly moving through us. The question is, how do we understand it and utilize this knowledge of what, because obviously you don't want to go suck on a thorium lollipop, right? There's a certain bandwidth around which it's healthy and actually makes our lives better, more and healthier, and then there's a certain bandwidth around which we would want to stay away from it, or at least control it. So, radiation. Before 1800, it was only understood that the visible light spectrum was all that we had access to when we think about light. We didn't know of anything beyond that. We knew about electricity because of Benjamin Franklin, and we knew about batteries because of Alexander Volta. So you started getting a certain stimulation of the mind around the time of the American Revolution, where all of these scientists were working with the American revolutionaries at trying to reproduce a type of government in Europe that could exist without the control of oligarchy and which would respect the dignity of the human mind. Because Benjamin Franklin, as a great representative of this process of revolution, was not a nobility. He was not from a special family. And he was working to shape people like Lavoisier as part of this revolutionary network in France, in Germany, in Poland, that would be a part of this new type of government that had never been, but that would be centered around the creative development of human reason as your primary goal in lawmaking and in economics. It was not about taxes that you don't want to pay to the British Empire. It was something much higher that we're not exposed to in the Western education system. But what happened? 1800 rolls around, and you've got two figures. Johann Ritter is one guy who's inspired by the discoveries of Wilhelm Herschel. All right, Herschel, both these guys, Prussian-German, actually it says Polish, sorry. Herschel, what does he do? He's looking at your little, bandwidth of colors that occur when you have a prism, right? That separates sunlight into different colors. And he wonders, well, is there anything, when these colors drop off on the red end, is there anything that is still happening? If you guys were exploring that question, do you guys have an idea what you might do to figure out, or what test you might want to do?
Filter?
What's
the glass?
Well, the glass is used to break it up. Now, what if every color emitted a different heat? Right? What if all the colors blue, purple, blue, orange, red, yellow? What if they were all different temperatures? Would that give you an idea of what you could do to figure out if there's something happening outside of the limits of red, where you don't see light?
Thermometer?
Thermometer, yeah. What he started doing is he started placing thermometers, very sensitive thermometers, outside of red, because it is discoverable, and we can all test this out, that your blue is of a lesser heat than orange, which is of a lesser heat than red, right? And as you move through, opposite what I just said, it gets hotter and hotter as you go from blue to red. And he decided, well, what if I start putting thermometers outside of the spectrum? What happens? And he was very surprised to find that it was getting hotter and hotter and hotter, even though there was no light hitting those thermometers. So what was hitting those thermometers causing that rise in the thermometer. There must be something that today we call it infrared light. Infrared light. A year later, 1801, this Polish fellow was completely inspired by his discoveries. Europe is abuzz that there's something beyond the senses in the light domain. And he does the same thing, but now for him it's a little bit more complicated because the thermometer doesn't show up anything different on the blue side. But what he discovers is that there's something called silver chloride. And silver chloride is a compound which has an effect where when it's hit by sun, it turns black. And if the intensity of the sun is very, very harsh, like for example, if you're dealing with a hotter temperature, like, If you're dealing with the blue temperatures, it turns black very quickly. If you're dealing with the red temperatures, it turns black very slowly. It's opposite what I just said. But that's the observable relationship between silver chloride and the sun. Red light turns it black slowly, blue light very quickly. So he did the same thing, right, as Herschel did with the thermometer, but he now started putting silver chloride where there was no light being hit after the violet, and discovered that, holy wow, this is turning black even faster than anything else. And it would continue to turn black faster and faster and faster the more you move to the right of violet, ultraviolet light. Now this gave us a new domain of action where we could start experimenting with these phenomena that we didn't otherwise exist, we didn't know existed. For example, with the discoveries of electricity, the discoveries of ultraviolet light, what we started discovering is that certain types of elements, like certain types of gases, when put inside of a vacuum, a tube that had been removed of all of its air, and an electrical shock sent through it, with a positive and a negative, like a cathode and anode at either extreme, you would get a fluorescent, beautiful light that would appear, depending on whether you're using neon or whether you're using some other gaseous element. Not only that, but it was discovered that when you put an intense magnet, that this ray, this cathode ray, will move according to the magnet. And that's how it was discovered that this cathode ray is actually a negative charge. Another type of ray was discovered later on by drilling a hole in one of the sides. And that hole all of a sudden started emitting another type of ray that nobody could figure out until they realized that putting an opposite type of magnet near that one caused it to move in the opposite direction than the cathode ray, meaning that there was something else which is positively charged, but of less, within that tube, within that gas. But you could only know it if you had the discoveries of electricity behind you and the discoveries that were being made of ultraviolet light. Now the thing about this was that it was also discovered by this fellow, Willem Röntgen, that inside of his laboratory, which was fully dark, if you had a fluorescent painted screen, or anything that was fluorescent painted anywhere in the laboratory, even if it was like in a box, it would light up in proximity to his cathode experiments. So where this thing was present, where this thing was happening, what you would find is that there would be these fluorescent objects that he would have completely cut off from any actual light emitted from this, and yet still were emitting a glow. What was stimulating that glow if it wasn't anything physical? Right? You could put it in a wooden box. No actual light hitting it. What's causing that? You guys know the answer to that one, right? Mm-hmm. What form of light penetrates through matter?
X-ray.
Ultraviolet.
X-rays. Yeah, because ultraviolet will stimulate the glow, but you have to actually touch it. If you're in a black room, like if you go to I haven't been to a club in many years, but when you see black light, your white shirt or anything fluorescent will glow. But if you put a wall between you and that black light, it won't glow anymore. So there's something else which must be emitting from this source, which would account for it, that has a penetrating power to film the bones in your hand. And after a couple of weeks of constant experimentation in his lab, this guy locked himself up there and just tried to figure this out. He came out with an ability to actually develop film using X-rays, and this is his wife's hand in her wedding ring. Now, due to the fact that society was a lot more Promethean back then, within a matter of weeks from this discovery, there was already medical applications being used to set a broken bone in place. You immediately had people creatively thinking about how do we apply this new idea to make life better for people. right? See, that's somewhat different from the type of philosophy we have governing the world today, where amazing breakthroughs have been made already on space technology and fusion and other things. And the only place where we're talking about plasmas is in our TV screens. The actual idea of ending hunger is not really very present in the minds of a lot of people subjected to the Western Zeusian brainwashing. So we know now of something positively charged, something negatively charged, that emits in the form of certain gases in a vacuum tube that have the quality of emitting ultraviolet light.
Just to be clear, was that the other thing? Where did he find the X-ray? Because he was trying to figure out what's making it glow, but where was it coming from?
It's coming from this. There's something within here
it was
that's
coming from
emitting
that.
a
Yeah,
quality
just to
of
be
light
clear.
that we didn't know existed before. It was already doing it, but he just was able to then discover what its nature was and start utilizing that concept, that immaterial concept that has no form, could then start become something which he could then use to wield to not only make more discoveries, but make life better for people at the same time. And they both work together very much. One of his admirers, this other scientist, who was a world's leading expert on luminescence, was a fellow named Henri Becquerel. Have people heard of Monsieur Becquerel? Okay, well, Becquerel was wondering, where is the source coming from? Is it something within the glass? Is it maybe the glass tube itself which is emitting these X-rays? What's doing this? And that was what he was looking at. He thought it was the glass itself that was being stimulated by the electric current that was causing these X-rays to emit. It wasn't. Nobody knew that if it was coming from the gas itself or what. His hypothesis and the dominant hypothesis of his day was that we knew of all sorts of fluorescent and phosphorescent materials and minerals and even glowworms, and there's things in nature that glow, but they only glow when they were subjected to sunlight. You could put we've all have little glowy toys, right, that you put in the sun and then you put it into a dark room and it'll glow, but the glow dissipates after a while. That energy that it was sucking in is finite. It's like that energy is slowly leaving as the glow disappears. Same thing for these minerals in nature. And he thought maybe that's what's maybe occurring. And what he would do is he would take these different types of substances, one of them that had uranium within it, a form of pitch blende. It's a composite of a variety of elements, but it has a lot of uranium. Had a very big glow when you would put it out in the sunlight. And then what he would do is he would take it back into his lab after it sucked in the sun, and he would put it on a photographic plate, and then develop the plate and see if indeed it was emitting that radiation. Now, there was a bit of a surprise because what happened after a few days of no sunlight, there was just really really bad weather. Sorry, I'm not used to having a young child in the audience. What happened after many days of very bad weather is that he said, well, okay, I'm just going to try something else. I don't want to totally waste my time, so I'm going to wrap this uranium, mineral inside of some black paper, and I'm going to put it in my drawer. I'm going to put it next to some photographic plates. I'll put a little coin inside of the black paper as well to see, if it's going to develop a film, the coin will show up because it'll block the rays that would be emitted from the rock. But there's no sunlight. It didn't capture any sunlight. So he leaves there for about a day, and he comes back and he decides to develop the film, the plates. And sure enough, even without having received any sunlight, plates have a little coin. There's a little picture of a coin, meaning that there's something within those uranium-enriched rocks which is emitting a lot of radiation to develop the plate. Now this is a mind-blowing one, because all of a sudden this challenges something really big. I'm not going to say what that is yet. Because this means that there's something, it's not like you have energy from the universe being collected into an object and being released. Because that's what people thought, which was the basis of all science, was conservation of energy. There's a finite amount of energy in the universe. There's nothing more that can be created and nothing more that can be destroyed. All of the energy is just moving from place to place. Well, this is a bit different all of a sudden, because if this energy is not being collected from the sun and then being released, it means that there's a lot of energy somehow within the material, the matter itself, being generated from within it. Where did that energy come from? Right? Our very idea of matter is all of a sudden getting very, very messy. So, by this point, and I didn't even talk about radio waves. Microwaves were only discovered later on in the 1940s through a melted chocolate bar. But our idea of reality is expanding quite a bit by this point. By around the 1895, 1896 period, right, this is when a lot of this stuff is real. The density of discoveries is increasing really fast. And to clarify what Becquerel is dealing with, two of his associates, Madame Curie, Mary Curie, a Polish woman, who was a poetic spirit. This woman wanted to be a writer for most of her life. Her father was part of the revolutionary movement in Poland to become a Polish republic. She was a very strong-willed person, and she devoted her life to truth, to making discoveries, as a way to liberate the mind, because she knew that all of the revolutions that had been attempted in Poland all failed because they were all based on just taking up arms against a much stronger, Russian power that was able to always just flatten the revolutionary tendency. But a revolution based on ideas, where you could actually create a fervor of discoveries in the arts and in the sciences, that's what was needed then. That's what's needed today too. Because people talk about a revolution against empire. If they're not actually cultivating their own powers of creative thought to make new geniuses, it's not really going to go very far. So Madame Curie and Pierre Curie, her husband, were looking at the results of this thing, and they went further to define it by realizing that using a special type of instrument called an electroscope, they could isolate the nature, what it was, because Becquerel didn't yet know if it was uranium or something else with the uranium. There's a lot of composites in that substance. So what Curie did is that her and her husband began isolating. They used some sort of a way to melt the uranium salts out of the substance, the pitch blende, that Becquerel was working with. And strangely enough, yes, by themselves the uranium did emit energy, right? But there was something else within that substance of pitch blende that, without the uranium, emitted more energy. So there's something else in there that's way more radioactive than the uranium was by itself. The way that they were testing this was they had an electroscope, which is based on having an electric charge go through two gold foil leaves. And when you have an electrical charge, you can cause both to be positively charged, which would cause them to split up, because two positive charges or negative charges repel each other. And then by bringing in anything that's a radioactive substance, like uranium, it would cause, by giving off a certain amount of radiation, it would ionize the air in between to create a positive charge. And then both of those leaves would then suck back together again, because now the internal air within them had a positive charge, pulling both negative charges back together. The speed at which those leaves would recombine would determine what's called the ionizing power of the radiation. So the ionizing power of the uranium by itself was of a lower order. The gold sheets, the electric sheets, would go back slower than they did if the uranium was pulled out of it and that substance was brought back there. So there's something even stronger, which ends up being discovered to be polonium. She names it polonium after Poland, which wasn't even a nation at the time. Poland was claimed between Prussia and Germany and some other country, and so there wasn't really a nation on any of those maps of Poland, but there was a strong national culture anyway that was being defended. So she, as a way to take a stand and to inspire people, she named this new element polonium, and this further developed into there was even, after getting rid of the polonium, there was something even more radioactive by thousands of degrees inside of the substance, and it took a couple of years to isolate that, and that became known as radium. Right? And then later on, thorium was discovered by her as well. So the interesting thing about this, and this is again why you have to be a Promethean if you're going to be making discoveries. You have to have this quality of insight to know that the universe is an open system. It's not a closed system. Because if you presume that it's a closed system, then anything that's already known is all that can be known. That there's nothing new that you could create that's not already within the knowledge base of human society. So how are you going to make a discovery if you assume that everything that's known is already there? So people like the Curies, like Becquerel, like Roentgen, are very unique and special. And the insight that Madame Curie had in 1904, based on these new discoveries, was interesting. She wrote, "If we assume that radium contains a supply of energy, which it gives out little by little, we are led to believe that this body does not remain unchanged, as it appears to, but that it undergoes an extremely slow change. Several reasons speak in favor of this view. First, the emission of heat, which makes it seem probably that a chemical reaction is taking place in the radium. But this is no ordinary chemical reaction, affecting the combination of atoms in the molecules. No chemical reaction can explain the emission of heat due to radium." You guys all heard the difference between an atom and a molecule, right? So H2O is like, two hydrogens and an oxygen, a molecule. But if you look at any one of the individual hydrogen, the two hydrogen atoms or the individual oxygen atom, it's an atom if you take it separately and look at it by itself. Now, up until now, it was presumed that the atoms were the smallest unbreakable part of nature, that you can't go smaller than an atom. It's the fundamental building block around which nothing more can be known. Well, it's challenging all of that. This means that there's actually processes going on inside of the atom within it, which are smaller than the atom, but that define its macro characteristics. Right? And it has a lot to do with this quality of energy. So she says no chemical reaction, chemical being that which molecules make together, certain things break apart, heat is given out. No chemical reaction can explain the emission of heat due to radium. Furthermore, radioactivity is a property of the atom of radium. If then it is due to a transformation, this transformation must take place inside the atom itself. Consequently, from this point of view, the atom of radium would be in a process of evolution, and we should be forced to abandon the theory of the invariability of atoms, which is the foundation of modern chemistry. So she's laying down the gauntlet. We've got to get rid of this idea of an unchanging, closed universe and accept the fact that everything is constantly changing, but with principles organizing it. There's notable principles organizing the constant change. Now, this is a bit of a shockwave for two reasons. On the one hand, because this means that what we thought we knew about the periodic table of elements, right, the atoms that exist in discoverable nature, at least the 92 naturally occurring ones, and then the ones that we later on discovered that we can create with this knowledge, that no longer are these can't be seen as just these fixed particles of nature. They're constantly in a state of transformation, becoming something other than what they are at a given moment. Not only that, but her discoveries with her husband, they also prove that Mendeleev was right. You guys heard of Dmitry Mendeleev? Okay. What's brilliant about Mendeleev's discovery, which was only confirmed because of Curie and because of these fellow discoverers with her, or primarily her, is that he wasn't seen as a crazy old man anymore, because in his system, something like 12 or 14 of the elements that we currently know, like we know that there's 92, he only knew of about 66 elements in 1865 when he made his discovery. And yet, his discovery was based on the periodicity that we today know. He said, if you look at the original charts of Mendeleev's graph, of how he discovered the ordering principle of what unifies everything, there's about 14 empty spots. And in those 14 empty spots, he says there will be discovered something there that we don't yet know, which will have this atomic weight. It'll have these properties. It'll combine with these other elements. Right? Of course he's crazy. Naturally, how can you possibly know that? There's no, So he was actually not treated with a lot of respect in his day. And it was only when, indeed, radium, polonium, thorium were discovered years later that it was confirmed that his method of thinking was superior than all of the other scientists in the world who were looking at it in a completely different, closed way. Right? He was able to forecast the future. He didn't have a crystal ball, but he was able to forecast the future. And his forecast was able to have measurable impact upon future states of human potential population, human productivity. He was actually a member of the Productive Forces, the Council of Productive Forces in Russia, and he was the Minister of the Protective Tariff that worked to reproduce Abraham Lincoln's Industrial Revolution in Russia. He was the guy who was in charge of that working in the government. That was Mendeleev.
He visited the Centennial exhibition.
He was the Russian representative. Yeah, he was with the Russian delegation in America in 1876, when America unveiled all of its industrial wonders that it had made through a completely opposed system to British free trade. And him and people from all over the world, just like him, reproduced this magnificent effect in their own countries with the Trans-Siberian Rail, the mineral development projects, and the industrial projects that could only be done by Mendeleev's control of the protective tariff. That you would have a tax to protect your local Russian farmers and Russian industrialists so that the British Empire couldn't flood your country with cheap crap made from India that was also kept subjected to British free trade policies by producing opium. So it was all part of a network of evil that people finally woke up to, and these scientists were all on the forefront of the battle against the evil.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not only that, but within a very short period of time, and I skipped gamma rays being discovered, because in the course of the radiation, it was discovered that there's certain types of radiation that can be blocked very easily with even your skin, with one sheet of paper, and other types of radiation would penetrate beyond your hand, beyond many sheets of paper, and could only be blocked after a sustained period of, like, let's say you put a lot of aluminum foil together, walls, that would finally would dissipate and stop penetrating. Right? And then what was discovered is that the one that had more penetrating power also had a negative charge. This became called beta decay. The type of things that, the 40,000 of those things that happen in your body every second of the day because of bananas and other fruits. Beta, negatively charged radiations, particles being emitted from anything radioactive. The alpha ones were positive charged. So the ones that were stopped simply by your skin had a positive charge, and they were called alpha decay. So you have alpha, you've got beta, alpha positive, beta negative. Beta has more penetrating power. But there was still another type of radiation that didn't have a positive or a negative charge to it, that was discoverable at least. And that became known as gamma rays, being emitted from thorium or radium or uranium. And those can only be blocked with like lead or even cement. Those who had the maximum penetrating power, they would just go through anything. Which is why, again, gamma rays are not the type of thing you want to necessarily bask in unnecessarily, but even those within certain minimal limits are good for your health.
So we're not going to turn into the Hulk if we're exposed to gamma radiation.
If you want to volunteer, you can. Now, to make things even more interesting, it was a discovery made soon thereafter, was that not only is every element changing, but that everything above lead, every element above lead, is actually changing according to a certain decay chain. And there were discovered to be 3 different decay chains, sequences, where, as you see here, the top is uranium-238, it's an isotope of uranium. And as it gives off radiation, right, it's becoming a different element. So that uranium-238 is slowly becoming thorium-234, and as it's giving off more beta decays, right, it's constantly becoming protactinium-234, and this is happening all the way through the periodic table of elements, going up, going down, all the way to the point of lead, which is the end destination point for every 3 decay chains. They all take a different pathway. Right? There's different pathways that all of the elements are moving through, but their end point is lead-206, which is relatively inert. You can't say it's unchanging, but it's changing at a completely slower rate.
So lead 206 or 214?
206. I may be wrong, maybe it could be a different isotope of lead that might be a destination for other ones. But I know that there's 3, and a 4th one was later on discovered after we developed particle accelerators.
We've got lead 214, lead 210 up there.
Yep. Yeah, so it becomes lead, different isotopes of lead, but then after lead 210, it becomes bismuth 210 after it continuously emits beta. And some of these, at some points, it's emitting negative beta particles, and at other points, like when it's becoming uranium-234 to thorium-230, it's emitting alpha particles during that time. And everything, what you see here are the times of their half-lives, how long it takes half of that atom to become something other than what it is. So this one's like a really long time, billions of years for uranium-238 to decay. Huh?
Like you mean the uranium-238, its
Yeah.
structure is altered, so it gets transformed into thorium.
Its identity is altered first and
It becomes a
foremost, and
different-
its structure alters secondarily. It's not that its structure is altering then its identity, it's that its identity is changing. Because how it reacts to everything else around it will be different from thorium, which will react differently to pressure, temperature, the quality of energy is emitted. So everything has its own identity, and that's what's changing.
So just
Yeah.
so thorium-234 exists as such. I mean, it's not the uranium-238 that is the how can I say that? Does it derive from uranium-238,
Yeah.
or it exists
It
already in a?
No, everything. Well, that's the thing. We still have to discover some of these things, right? We don't know what comes first. I mean, what came before uranium-238, right? There's certain questions that this opens up. It's just that when you observe that there are these evolutionary pathways, it allows your mind to then ask newer, better questions.
Okay, so it exists separately in nature without uranium's alteration.
I think this is the effect of that, but I think that that's probably the effect of something else too.
We would probably have to discover like what's actually going on, the processes inside the Earth.
Well, you have to discover the nature of the fusion process itself, the fission-fusion process, because we know how atoms change. Megan touched on this a little bit in her presentation, which is there's something called fission, right? We're just scratching the surface. This is all brand new knowledge from the last century. We don't know about most of this. But we have something called fission, where you can, start with uranium-235 in this case, and when one neutron hits it, it can set a chain reaction into motion where new neutrons are being emitted to go into other uranium atoms, that as this is happening, and as these are breaking up, like this uranium becomes Ba and Kr, what is that, krypton and barium?
Yeah, there.
And then 3 neutrons. And then those 3 neutrons can then go and stimulate similar reactions in uranium-235 isotopes around them. And that type of chain reaction is something which emits a lot of energy, a lot of heat. So much heat that, people like real scientists like Frederick Soddy, who was working in Montreal in this period and made some really great discoveries, made the observation way before commercial atomic reactors were ever put online, decades before that. He made the point that the unlimited ascent to knowledge, and through knowledge to physical power and dominion over nature. Oh, sorry, radium represents. Radium represents the unlimited ascent to knowledge, and through knowledge to physical power and dominion over nature. Radium has taught us that there is no limit to the amount of energy in the world available to support life. Right, so you already have humanists who are creative, who are seeing the goodness that could be now represented by this new amazing breakthrough in our understanding of how matter becomes energy. Because what you're dealing with in this process is literally matter and energy being not something which is two different concepts. They're very much interconnected. And there's a lot of energy in every little particle of matter, more than could exist in thousands of barrels of oil, if you harnessed it properly. The other obvious effect is, of nuclear forces involves fusion. Right? So instead of you looking at the heavier elements at the bottom of the periodic table, you can look at the lighter ones at the top. And this is the example of tritium and deuterium that Megan showed, which are that's one choice you could use to combine these 2 lighter isotopes of hydrogen and have them fused together within certain conditions that we can play with inside of plasmas, multi-million degree heated plasmas, in which it's been observed for a long time that they will fuse together, creating something brand new that had not existed in the sum of the 2 parts that had formerly made it up. And that involves a free neutron leaving it, and helium being created, and a little bit of mass defect. So all of a sudden there's a little if you add the mass of these 2 things together, and then you add the mass of these 2 things together, their effect, it ain't the same thing. There's a little bit of mass missing now. And that's where you get this little red arrow there. Because that little bit of missing mass is a hell of a lot of energy. Do we know what causes that? Do we know the nature of fusion? Not really. We're sort of playing with effects right now. We assume, based on good evidence, that something to do with fusion and a little bit to do with fission is occurring inside of the sun and of every star and of a lot of nebulae, probably also within the Earth. There's probably a lot of radiation actually within the depths of the Earth, below the deepest penetration that we've ever made as human beings, which has only been 14 kilometers down. But there's enough evidence to show that there's a lot of radiation down there, which causes a lot of the background radiation, because if you take a Geiger counter to any part of the Earth, like I was talking to my mother and my aunt a little earlier, there's a beach in Brazil. You take a Geiger counter there, it's like 10 times more than Fukushima. And people, it's a renowned, famous beach where people will go there for generations to just lay in the sand, and it cures arthritis. Longevity is increased. Cancer is, a minimal issue. It's not really anything comparable to any other part of the world. So you have natural background radiation.
Sand and bring it here.
That's actually you could buy Brazilian sand online, and maybe we could increase our fundraising by.
Yeah, we got a guy in Brazil, and he can take care of you.
Well, both bananas at our table deployments now. So again, these are just things that we're beginning to know. Are they're organized in the behavior of the periodic table of elements as a whole. What's going on below lead for the 82 elements below lead? What's happening there? Some of them are radioactive, but what's the nature of the what other processes? I mean, we know that there's something called antimatter, matter-antimatter. We know of its existence. We know what role it plays in the organization of the periodic table. And your question? Not yet, but it'll probably answer, a further exploration of these things will answer a lot of questions like where do the elements on different planets come from, right? Why do certain suns emit some elements and some spectrums of the radioactive frequency more than other suns?
Sorry, this one.
Yeah.
Is it to say that the uranium-238 is the most radioactive and the lead-206 is the least radioactive?
I mean, lead-206 is not radioactive.
It's not.
This is not that radioactive either, though. Some are more and some are less. Okay. Usually things that have very long half-lives are not that radioactive. Things that have short half-lives, like uranium-234 to 24 days.
Oh, so it's not by radioactive.
Yeah, if the half-life is very short, it means it's very radioactive.
So protract,
I mean, it breaks down quickly.
Yeah.
And that means it releases a lot of either beta or alpha rays. So we know now that beta penetrates more easily through material.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a beta with a short lifespan, I think it's pretty radioactive.
Oh yeah.
But
So,
you can
but you can.
you can have a short lifespan, but the alpha ray, that would not be that dommageable. It wouldn't go even through your skin.
But by disputing the inactivity of the atom theory, Marie Curie tried to prove that, let's say here, the lead-206 is not really stable as we think it is, for instance, and that it could be radioactive, but it's moving at a very low.
She didn't believe that there was anything non-changing, and she knew that her discovery was a good presentation of evidence that everything is changing, but sometimes at rates that are beyond our current ability to measure it, right? That's all. Whether she even knew about lead-206 at that time, I don't even think so, because I don't think isotopes were very well understood. We were only beginning to get a sense, like today we know that there's 92 elements on the periodic table. We know there's a little bit more that humans have created, called transuranics, but there's 3,000 isotopes. Every single element has 2 to 10 isotopes. We mentioned carbon-14, right? There's carbon-12 and carbon-13 too. Only carbon-14 is radioactive, right? So you've got over 2,500 isotopes. We only have use for maybe 300 of them with our current modern technology that we're at right now at this level of society. We've only found use for a small portion of them. We figure as we expand out into the universe, into the solar system, and as we start harnessing more control of plasmas and fusion power, we're going to probably find many more uses for things like helium-3, which today we have no use for, really. without the discovery of fusion power, helium-3 doesn't play much of a role. It has no value. It's only with the discovery of fusion that helium-3 its value increases and other values of other elements decrease. You can see why geopoliticians would hate this. Because they want to control the values that exist now with resources that exist now, not things that they don't control yet. Yep.
Wouldn't that be like going from wood to coal to petroleum?
Exactly, yeah.
It's,
That's
the
exactly
value is,
Exactly. The values are constantly changing of the things, so the only thing which has constant value is the power of the creative mind to always make discoveries. And we have to have faith that in a million years, human children that are living in a world that's beyond our imagination will still have certain constant qualities that we share in common with them, and that we're shared in common with the kids of ancient Persia, that we can all develop our powers of creative thought and translate that back to making life better for people that come after us. Right? And people, like, if you read the writings of anybody who is worth anything, in terms of Martin Luther King or anybody who actually died for a principled good, they all had that common faith, regardless of what religion or culture they're from. Now we have John F. Kennedy, who had, not that 1963, as he was unveiling the space program, calling for a peace between the Soviet Union and America, developing nuclear rockets and investing more in breakthroughs in atomic power. He made the point in a speech that man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of poverty. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths. For more than 3 years, I have spoken about the new frontier. This is not a partisan term, and it is not the exclusive property of Republicans or Democrats. It refers instead to this nation's place in history, to the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an end to be characterized by achievement and by challenge. It is an era which calls for action and for the best efforts of all those who would test the unknown and the uncertain in every phase of human endeavor. It is a time for pathfinders and pioneers. This is a day before he died, November 21st, 1963. 2 days, sorry. He died on November 23rd in Dallas, Texas.
And where was that given, that speech?
Forget. So if you look at it, what happened over the ensuing 50 years since his death? Right? I mean, kids at a very early age in school are being bombarded with Al Gore's inconvenient truth. Man is a virus. We're overpopulated. Human CO2 is causing the destruction of nature. Nuclear power is the cause of our problems. That's Mr. Burns's are controlling all the nuclear reactors. They want to, run the world. And they're given a self-image of man as an animal, as worse than an animal, as a virus that is unbecoming of any creative person. You cannot solve problems facing humanity if you have the self-identity of man as a scum of the earth that can only pollute, and that people often say that babies are pollution machines. Why do you want to have babies? Right? It's terrible, and kids again are given a lot of propaganda. And this is 50 years now into this idea that green is the new religion. But little do they know that the solutions of decarbonizing the world the way COP21 calls for, or bringing windmills and solar panels to Africa, are actually colonial programs to destroy these countries' ability to ever become industrial, modern countries. So it is actually a cover for a new form of genocide. And most people, if they understood that, they would reject it. So it's really a question of understanding, to be able to wield, I'm not going to read that, to be able to read into the human condition well enough so that we could get people to laugh at what they're afraid of, to realize that radiation is not to be afraid of. Overpopulation, it's not to be afraid of. Empires and stupidity, that's to be afraid of, but we could do something about that. And ultimately, when you do start getting into, and this is why we have a lot of documentation that I would encourage everyone here to, put down a contribution towards a subscription to our science magazine or our intelligence publications, which goes through an understanding of what it is that we are now facing with this new extermination of mankind that the British monarchy, the forces of the British Empire that control Wall Street, and the forces in Saudi Arabia, they're all committed to doing, using this veneer of a green global government. And in understanding the evil, and understanding what the evil is afraid of, we're going to be in a very good situation to accept the offers that Vladimir Putin, that Xi Jinping, and that other actual real humanist warriors have presented to us now to work with, so that we can tap into the new Silk Road, into the new paradigm of development, which is awakening as we speak. So that's the end of my presentation. Bob should be here soon. Can someone call Bob?
I'll call Bob.
I was just wondering.
Yeah, I can take a question or two, yeah.
Earlier, when you were talking about Marie Curie, you said something important when at the end she was disputing the invariability of the atom theory. So you said that you know, everything, well, let's say here the atom has a certain, like inside that there's a certain action, but that we cannot understand because it's evolving very, very, very slowly, right? And that everything, after all, corresponds to this, let's say, logical or natural organization force. You use the term that I like, but what was it, like, tout répond à une certaine logique d'organisation.
An organizing principle,
like,
an
exactly.
intelligible organizing principle.
Exactly. So, in this respect, saying that humans' activity did not really destroy the planet and the technology of man doesn't have any negative influence on this planet and even perhaps on the solar system, would seem to me in this respect, you know, something that, well, disputable, let's say, because if every movement we do and every action we make has certain consequences, so in this respect seems to me a little bit exaggerated to say that what man is doing in this planet doesn't have any repercussions either in this planet or in the universe.
Well, maybe there's a bit of confusion there. Well, here, look, I think there's maybe a bit of miscommunication because I didn't say that we couldn't destroy the Earth. I never said that. We can have nuclear war, we can cut forests, we can do a lot of damage. I'm not saying that. I'm not even saying that we can't affect climate because if you cut a desert, if you cut a forest or you green a desert, you're going to affect climate, for good or for bad. The question is, and this is the big question which Bob is going to get into, what type of attitude and method of thinking should we be able to discover, to adopt, in order to know that the changes that we're going to be making are going to have as beneficial of effect as possible without any guarantees. Because you can never have a formula that tells you you won't mess up. That'll never happen. So the question is, how do we develop an insight into what direction the universe is already moving in, such that we can take it and make it more efficient? Let me give you an example. I said that there's 92 elements occurring in nature, right? Okay, what about the other elements that are on the periodic table that don't occur in nature? Where did they come from?
Is it black magic?
Close, but no. Try again. These. Above 92, you got 93, Neptunium, Plutonium, Americium, Curium, you got all these things, Einsteinium, Fermium, Mendelevium, somewhere there. Where did they come from? We also got a whole bunch that don't have names yet.
Did we create them?
We created them. Does it mean that they would not exist in nature had we not created them? No. It means that there's all of these things to evolve, since, like Madame Curie said, the periodic table is evolving. There's a state of evolution. Just like the living things, right? Living things evolve. We weren't all here. At some point, there were just single-celled amoebas on the Earth 500 million years ago. But you have a direction to the change. In the same way, there's a direction to the change, but for things that took billions of years to evolve, to come into the scene, all of a sudden we took that natural evolution of new elements appearing within our solar system, and we could say is we bent the curvature of space-time. We condensed time based on the mind, but not the mind's ignorance. We based it only on the mind. We could bend the time based on the mind's knowledge. Where what we've seen is that there's a per capita accessibility of energy for society which has been increasing at a relatively exponential rate. leading all the way up through the 1960s and into the beginning of the 70s. Now, the general trend has been that, I mean, at a certain point, all there was wood, right? When coal became observed to be so much more efficient, that the amount of volume that you can burn from coal will produce so much more work, to do so much more good for humanity, the wood was increasingly phased out of our energy basket in the West. Obviously, due to empire, the developing sector of the world still burns a lot of wood in places like Africa and South America and beyond. But what we had is a phasing out of the less efficient form of fire and a replacement with the more efficient one, which each one is finite. But you had a similar downward trend as oil became observed to be more efficient than coal. Coal became less used as oil became more of its replacement, until we started discovering something around the course of the Manhattan Project in the United States, that there's something within the atom itself that can be unlocked, which is such a great source of power, that it would make all of the other forms of fossil fuels completely redundant. Crisis. And that's certainly no different for today. People often think that science is out of the purview of political agendas. Science is pure, right? We get this a lot when we're organizing astronauts, people of the scientific community who say, oh, I like truth, but I don't like politics. I want to just do my science. And little do they realize that that's the most political place in the world. Because there's a battle over science. Who controls the interpretations of scientific facts, right? Because the science, whatever science you have will be able to be perverted to justify the expansion of an evil structure of empire. That's been like that for a long time too. Today, two of the core fears that people have in the Western society, which I'm going to address one of them, is the fear of radiation. And I'm using this topic, that it's actually the fear itself which is deadly. The radiation itself is not. After I present, Dr. Bob Hutz will come in and he's going to present something on climate change, why mankind should not be afraid that we are causing global warming because we're industrialized, because we're growing our population. These are not real legitimate fears. They've been implanted there in our hearts artificially as a political agenda. Megan Beats and Pim both went through the issue of Prometheus versus So to begin the second panel of today's proceedings, the theme that we're going to be delivering is overcoming fear. And fear is not just something political. Obviously, it's been understood for a long time that there's really two ways of managing society. One is to inspiring that society to become better. People like Martin Luther King, Benjamin Franklin, all of the greatest leaders of history took on that approach, that is through love of your fellow man and inspiring a passion for the future, that you're going to get the most coherence out of your population to perform the best. JFK's space program is a recent example of that, and what we're seeing coming out of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, LaRouche, and the whole new alliance that's now being set up is really an expression of that sentiment. But what's another way to control society? What's another sentiment that can be used to manage a society, if not love?
Fear and anger.
Fear and anger. So fear is obviously something which has been observed for a long time, going back to Pharaoh and beyond, that is effective at keeping people in line like cattle. To the degree that people are afraid, they're not going to be thinking in a solution-oriented manner, especially in a time if we're able to discover that there is something within the substance of matter that, given certain conditions that we could create, would allow us to harness that and call it a resource. Otherwise, it was just a rock. Right. Oil 300 years ago was not a resource. It was something that maybe you could discover could light a lamp. So the question of what is really the resource, what's the constant? Out of all of the change of human history, of our changing relationship to the universe, of resources, there's all sorts of change, but what are the constants? What don't change? What allows for the transitions from lower states of potential to higher states of potential, to higher expressions of creativity? And that's going to largely be the substance of my class. In as short a period as I can. I have to end in about an hour and 5 minutes, so I'm going to see what I can get through, maybe not the whole thing. But first up, today we have seen, this is something that the organization produced a little while ago, to get a sense that in the last since 1780, there's been a general trend regarding the types of fire that we use, whether the fire is derived from burning wood, or burning coal, or burning oil, or burning chemical fuels, or burning things like the atom. there's been a general trend that the best way to understand human history is to recognize that there is a principal difference between the worldview and passion of a Prometheus, expressed in such people as we saw with John F. Kennedy and those who I mentioned, versus a Zeusian character like Obama, like the Queen, like the whole empire structure controlling and managing the transatlantic community. One other way to put this, to think about this in another clear way, is one represents a closed system, a system that assumes that whatever resources exist at a given time are finite, that the system as a whole that you want to manage is a closed, finite system, and the role of the governing class is really to keep things in line, to get people to fight over diminishing returns of resources. Because obviously, the more you grow, like Megan said, the Earth is finite, the more a population grows, the more resources it uses, the more tension builds up, and the more conflicts can be triggered artificially, over water, over oil, over whatever. An opposing view is that, no, actually, maybe resources are something that are, like Megan also made a point. She said resources are actually created. That things that we today call a resource 1,000 years ago were not resources. Iron before the Iron Age was not a resource. You had to have human thoughts and discoveries that